The air in the village of Oakhaven did not circulate, it stagnated, thick with the scent of damp wool, wood smoke, and the metallic tang of an approaching frost. It was the year of our Lord 1348, though in the shadow of the stone, years lose their numbering. Time, to the medieval mind, was not a river flowing toward a horizon, but a heavy, rotating wheel, grinding the wheat of human existence into the flour of eternity. Elara did not walk toward the church of St. Jude with the gait of a martyr. Her steps were rhythmic, measured by the heavy thud of a heart that had already accepted its own eulogy. She was 24, an age where the blood usually sings of harvest dances and the warmth of a kinsman's hand. Yet, she sought the anchoress's cell, a stone womb no larger than a prayer rug, built into the very ribs of the chancel wall. The bishop's procession moved with a funereal grace. The Gregorian chants rose like incense, cold and grey, curling around the pillars. There is a specific kind of silence that exists only in the presence of holy authority, a silence born of the realization that the individual is but a single grain of sand in the vast, terrifying hourglass of the church. To seek freedom in a cage is the ultimate paradox of the soul, the chronicler might write. For what is the world but a larger cell, walled in by the inevitability of decay? By narrowing the walls, one perhaps narrows the target that death seeks to strike. As Elara reached the threshold of the cell, the smell of fresh mortar met her. It was a clean, alkaline scent, the smell of a new beginning that was also an ending. The mason, a man with hands calloused by a lifetime of shaping flint, stood ready. He did not look her in the eye. To him, she was already a ghost. To look at a ghost is to invite the chill into one's own bones. She stepped inside. The space was 3 paces long and 2 paces wide. There was a slit for the light, the squint, angled toward the altar so she might witness the elevation of the host, and another small opening to the outside world for the passage of bread and the removal of waste. The bishop began the rite of enclosure. His voice was a drone, steady as the ticking of a clock that measures not minutes, but sins. Veni, Creator Spiritus. Then came the sound that would define the rest of her earthly tenure, the scrape of stone on stone. The mason began to lay the bricks. Clink. The first layer. The world of the church floor, the sight of her sister's weeping veil, and the smell of the damp earth outside vanished from her feet. Clink. The second layer. The warmth of the candlelight in the nave was halved. She watched the flickering shadows dance on the rough-hewn interior of her new skin. In the Middle Ages, the body was often viewed as a prison for the soul. Elara had simply decided to provide that prison with literal walls. Clink. The third layer. Now, only the bishop's mitre and the golden cross were visible. The air in the cell began to change. It grew heavy, recycled, intimate. It was the breath of a woman who had decided that the only way to own her life was to surrender it entirely to the great silence. Faith, in this era, was not a comfort, it was a transaction. It was the belief that by enduring a controlled agony, one could avert the chaotic agony of the afterlife. But as the mortar dried, Elara felt something other than fear. She felt the terrifying, cold purity of isolation. To be alone is to be face to face with the Creator, or perhaps worse, face to face with the echoing void where one expected the Creator to be. The final stone was hoisted. The mason paused, perhaps offering a silent prayer, or perhaps merely catching his breath. Through the thinning gap, Elara saw a single star, pale, distant, and indifferent. Then, the stone slid home. The darkness was not absolute, it was a thick, velvet gray. The sounds of the world, the shuffling of feet, the retreating chants, the wind in the yew trees, became muffled, as if the world had been submerged in deep water. She sat on the cold floor. The texture of the stone against her palms was her only reality. She was a living relic, a heartbeat inside a monument. She was dead to the law, dead to her family, and dead to the sun. And yet, in that first hour of total enclosure, the silence spoke louder than the bells ever had. It whispered that time had stopped, and in its place, something vast and ancient had begun to breathe alongside her. The first part of her journey was over. She had traded the horizontal world of paths and people for the vertical world of spirit and stone. The first month was not a descent into madness, but a slow dissolution of the ego. In the medieval mind, the self was a fragile thing, held together by the gaze of one's neighbors and the ritual of the community. Without the mirror of other faces, Elara found her own identity beginning to flake away like the dry lime on the walls. The cell was a vessel for the passage of seasons, yet it remained a constant, frozen climate of its own. The stone held the dampness of the earth, drawing the warmth from her limbs as if it were a jealous lover. Every morning, the gray light filtered through the squint, a thin, diagonal finger of dawn that pointed toward the altar. This light was her only clock. When it touched the base of the crucifix in the chapel beyond, she knew the first prayers of the monks were rising. When it vanished, she was truly alone. The smells became her universe. The primary scent was that of the cold flint, mineral, ancient, and indifferent. But there were intruders, the sharp, acidic odor of the tallow candle that she burned sparingly, the earthy, sweet smell of the rye bread pushed through the hatch, and the underlying, persistent scent of her own mortality. To be still is to invite the weight of the universe to rest upon your chest, Elara realized as she watched a spider weave its web in the corner. Is time a forward motion, or is it merely the slow wearing down of a stone by a single drop of water? If I do not move, does the world outside continue to rotate, or have I pinned the earth in place with my own silence? By the onset of November, the silence began to develop a texture. It was no longer the absence of sound, but a presence in its own right. She heard the wood of the church rafters contracting in the frost, sharp, bone-cracking snaps that echoed like pistol shots in the hollow space. She heard the mice scuttling beneath the floorboards, their tiny lives a frantic contrast to her own stillness. One evening, a voice came through the external slit. It was a woman from the village, her tone a mixture of terror and desperate hope. "Sister," the voice whispered, smelling of cheap ale and fear. "My child is burning with the sweat. Pray. You are closer to him now. You are in the tomb, surely he hears the dead more clearly than the living." Elara did not answer. The rule of the Reclusorium was one of distance. She was a conduit, not a companion. She knelt on the dirt floor, her knees numbing until they felt like two smooth river stones. She prayed, but not for the child's fever to break. She prayed for the child's soul to find a path through the dark woods of the afterlife, for she felt that life was merely a complicated way of delaying the inevitable. As she prayed, she realized that her compassion had changed. It was no longer the warm, human empathy of a sister or a daughter. It had become something colder, crystalline, a pity for all things that had to breathe and suffer under the sun. She felt a strange, bitter freedom. Outside, the villagers were slaves to the harvest, to the tax collector, to the whims of the plague that was whispered to be moving up from the south like a black fog. Inside, she was a slave only to the stone. And the stone asked nothing of her but her weight. The isolation began to peel back the layers of her memory. She remembered the taste of a wild plum she had eaten as a child, the burst of tart skin and the syrupy center. In the cell, that memory was more vivid than the bread she chewed. The mind, starved of new stimuli, begins to feast upon the past, turning old conversations into epic poems and forgotten glances into divine revelations. She began to see the shadows on the wall move. Not as ghosts, but as the slow, rhythmic pulse of the building itself. The church was a living beast of stone, and she was its heart, beating in the darkness. Death, she reflected, was not a skeleton with a scythe. It was a gradual thinning of the veil. It was the moment when the stone stopped feeling cold and began to feel like a shroud. She was learning to be dead while her lungs still worked, a feat of spiritual gymnastics that left her exhausted and strangely hollowed out. One night, the first snow fell. She couldn't see it, but she felt the change in the air, a profound, insulating quiet that muffled even the mice. The world was being buried, just as she had been. She curled into her thin woolen cloak, the scent of the frost seeping through the stones. She was a seed planted in the dark, waiting for a spring that she was no longer sure she wanted to see. The winter of 1348 did not break with the gentle thaw of spring, it broke with the sound of a tolling bell that refused to cease. Through the narrow squint of her cell, Elara watched the light change, but the air that drifted through the external slit carried a new, foul passenger. It was the scent of sweet rot and vinegar, the smell of a world trying to wash away the invisible. The Black Death had arrived in Oakhaven. From her stone sanctuary, Elara became a silent witness to the geography of grief. She could not see the faces of the villagers, but she heard their footsteps. They were no longer the heavy, purposeful strides of farmers, they were the frantic, uneven stumbles of the hunted. The churchyard, once a place of quiet rest, became a site of rhythmic digging. The sound of the spade hitting the earth, thuck, scrape, heave, became the new liturgy of the parish. Freedom, Elara whispered to the damp walls, her voice raspy from weeks of silence, is a cruel illusion for those with nowhere to run. They flee from a phantom that lives in their own breath, while I sit within the ribs of a tomb, the only one truly safe because I have already surrendered the world. The isolation, once a spiritual choice, now became a physical fortification. The village priest, a man whose voice had grown thin and brittle like parchment, no longer came to the squint to offer the host. He stayed at a distance, his prayers shouted from the far end of the nave. One day, he did not come at all. The silence that followed was not the holy stillness Elara had sought, but a heavy, suffocating vacuum. The sensory details of the plague filtered into her cell with agonizing clarity. She heard the low, guttural moans of the dying who crawled to the church steps, hoping for a miracle that the cold stones refused to grant. She smelled the bonfires of clothes and bedding, the acrid smoke stinging her eyes and coating her tongue with the taste of ash. One afternoon, a hand appeared at her external slit. It was not the hand of the deacon bringing bread. It was a hand covered in dark, weeping sores, the skin pulled tight over bone. "Sister," a voice croaked, it was Thomas, the mason who had walled her in. "The mortar, it holds. You are the lucky one. Pray for me. The ink of the devil is on my skin." Elara watched the hand. It trembled against the stone she called her home. She felt a surge of visceral horror, followed by a profound, hollow sadness. This man had built her prison, and now his own body was a prison he could not escape. She reached out, her fingers hovering just inches from the opening, but she did not touch him. The law of her enclosure forbade it, the fear of the rot commanded it. Time is a predator, she thought, withdrawing into the shadows of her corner. It hunts the young and the old with equal indifference. We build cathedrals and walls to hide from it, but the clock is inside us, ticking in our very blood. For 3 days, the bread did not come. Hunger began as a sharp, angry animal in her stomach, then subsided into a dull, floating lightheadedness. In this state, the walls of the cell seemed to breathe. The icons on the small altar she kept appeared to weep real salt. She began to wonder if the world outside had ended entirely, if she were the last living soul on a planet of corpses, a solitary heartbeat kept alive by the stubbornness of the stone. She contemplated the nature of faith in the face of extinction. Was God the architect of the plague, or was he, too, watching from behind a wall of celestial silence? She realized that her isolation was no longer a penance, it was a mirror of the divine condition, to see all, to feel all, but to be unable to touch the suffering below. On the 4th day, a small, stale crust of bread appeared in the hatch, pushed through by a child's trembling hand. There was no word spoken. The child ran away, the sound of small clogs echoing on the cobbles until they were swallowed by the wind. Elara held the bread as if it were a holy relic. It was dry, hard, and tasted of dust, but it was the taste of a world that, however broken, still persisted. She sat in the dark, chewing slowly, listening to the wind howl through the belfry. She was a ghost in a fortress, a witness to a tragedy she could not alter. The bitter truth was becoming clear: to be saved from the world is to be forgotten by it. The plague, having gorged itself on the vitality of Oakhaven, eventually receded like a black tide, leaving behind a shoreline of wreckage and a silence far more terrifying than the screams had been. The bells, which had tolled until the ringers themselves collapsed, were now mute. Through the internal squint, Elara watched the dust motes dance in the shafts of light within the empty nave. The church was no longer a house of prayer, it was a vast, hollow ribcage of a beast that had starved to death. The isolation shifted from a spiritual discipline into a profound, existential weight. Before, Elara had been a recluse in a bustling world; now, she felt like the last guardian of a graveyard. The occasional footsteps she heard outside were no longer hurried, they were dragging, heavy with the survivor's fatigue, the exhaustion of those who had looked into the abyss and were disappointed to still find themselves on the ledge. What is the value of a soul saved if there is no world left for it to inhabit? She wondered, tracing the jagged lines of a crack in the stone. We speak of eternity as a grand cathedral, but perhaps eternity is merely this: the same four walls, the same grey light, and the memory of a sun we no longer have the right to touch. Freedom is not the absence of walls, but the presence of a purpose. And my purpose has become a ghost. The sensory world within the cell became hyperacute, almost painful. The sound of a single rainbird outside felt like a needle piercing her eardrum. The smell of the earth after a storm, once a promise of growth, now smelled like the opening of 1,000 small graves. She began to lose the sense of her own body. When she touched her face, the skin felt like parchment stretched over a hollow gourd. She was becoming the stone. One day, a new priest arrived. He was young, his face unlined by the horrors of the previous year, sent from a distant diocese to reclaim the abandoned pews. He came to the squint to introduce himself, his voice echoing with an offensive, bright optimism. "Sister," he said, his shadow falling across her small altar. "The Lord has spared you for a reason. You are a beacon for the survivors. They need to see your devotion to know that God has not abandoned Oakhaven." Elara felt a cold, bitter spark in her chest. Devotion? Was it devotion to sit in the dark while children turned black and died in the streets? Or was it merely the ultimate form of cowardice, a way to hide from the messiness of death by embracing a clean, controlled version of it? "The light you see in me is merely the reflection of the void," she whispered, though she knew he couldn't hear her clearly. "You speak of God's plan as if it were a map of a garden, but it is a map of a wilderness where the tracks are washed away by blood." She began to experience the Noonday demon, the anxiety of the desert monks. Time became a thick, viscous liquid that refused to flow. She would stare at a single spider for hours, watching it struggle to repair a web broken by a stray draft. She saw herself in the spider, a creature obsessed with its own architecture, building a home out of its own entrails, only for the world to pass it by without a glance. The silence of the village was the hardest to bear. The absence of the blacksmith's hammer, the lack of children's laughter, the missing low of the cattle, these were the sounds that had anchored her to reality. In their place was a vacuum that she tried to fill with her own heartbeat. Thump thump. Thump thump. It was the only rhythm left. She realized that the greatest cruelty of the cell was not the lack of space, but the lack of change. In the world, even the most miserable man has the sunset, the turning of the leaf, the movement of the clouds. In the cell, there was only the stone. The stone did not grow, it did not die, it did not forgive. It simply was. And as she leaned her forehead against the cool flint, she understood that she had achieved her goal, she had become as unchangeable and as lonely as a star. By the 3rd year of her enclosure, the physical boundaries of the cell had ceased to be a barrier and had become a skin. Elara no longer felt where her own parched flesh ended and the damp limestone began. The temptation of the spirit did not come as a demon with horns or a vision of earthly delights, it came as a profound, chilling indifference. The young priest returned often to the squint, his voice a persistent hum against the silence. He spoke of the village's recovery, of new marriages, and of the fresh thatch on the roofs. He wanted her to be a symbol of endurance, a living monument to the survival of the faithful. But to Alara, his words were like pebbles dropped into a bottomless well. They made a faint sound on entry and were immediately swallowed by the dark. To be a symbol is to be emptied of one's humanity, she thought, her eyes fixed on the flickering wick of her final candle. They do not want Alara, the woman who once loved the smell of rain on clover. They want a statue that breathes. They want to believe that my suffering justifies their own, as if pain were a currency that could buy God's mercy. In the depths of this isolation, the concept of the soul began to frighten her. If the soul was eternal, then was she condemned to this internal monologue for 1 billion years? If the walls of the cell were meant to focus her mind on heaven, they had failed. They had instead focused her mind on the terrifying mechanics of her own consciousness. She began to hear her blood rushing through her ears, a rhythmic, oceanic roar that reminded her she was a biological machine trapped in a stone box. The smell of the cell had changed again. It was no longer the smell of the plague or the frost, but the scent of stagnation. It was the smell of water that has sat too long in a jar. One night, the moon aligned perfectly with the external slit, casting a silver bar across her floor. It was a cold, piercing light, and for a moment, it illuminated the grime under her fingernails and the gray streaks in her hair. She realized with a jolt of bitter clarity that she was aging for no one. Time was stealing her beauty, her strength, and her memory, and it was receiving nothing in return. Is this the freedom I sought? She whispered to the moon. The freedom to rot without being watched? The freedom to be forgotten before I am dead? She began to experience auditory hallucinations. She heard her mother's voice calling her from the kitchen of her childhood. She heard the laughter of the harvesters in the fields. These were not comforts, they were tortures. They reminded her that she had traded the messy, vibrant, sinful world for a purity that was indistinguishable from non-existence. She contemplated the crucifix on her wall. For years, it had been her anchor. Now, it looked like a warning. It depicted a man nailed to a tree, unable to move, trapped in his own agony for the sake of a world that would continue to sin regardless. She felt a kinship with the wood and the nails, but it was a kinship of resentment, not of worship. The ultimate temptation was the desire to scream, to shatter the holy silence of the church with a raw, animal cry that would let the villagers know that their saint was merely a woman burying herself alive. She gripped the stones until her knuckles bled, the metallic taste of her own distress filling her mouth. Faith, she realized, was not a ladder to the stars. It was a weight that held you underwater. And as the moon moved past the slit, leaving her in total darkness once more, she understood that the most difficult part of the journey was not the entry into the cell, but the realization that the door was not locked from the outside, but from within. She had built her own tomb, and she no longer remembered where she had hidden the key. The end did not come with a fanfare of angels, but with the quiet, rhythmic surrender of the body to the cold. It was the winter of 1352. The frost had climbed the interior of the stones, blooming in white, crystalline ferns that Alara traced with her fingertips. Her sight had grown dim, not from age, but from the darkness that she had invited into her eyes. The world outside had moved on, the village was repopulate, the fields were tilled by new hands, and she had become a legend, a ghost whispered about to keep children from straying too far into the churchyard. One evening, as the light failed for the final time, she felt a strange lightness in her chest. The hunger that had been her constant, gnawing companion for years had finally grown bored and departed. In its place was a vacuum of peace. Death, she whispered, her breath a faint mist in the freezing air, is not a wall. It is the moment the stone finally becomes transparent. We spend our lives building shells, of brick, of dogma, of fear, only to realize that the spirit was meant to be the wind that blows through the ruins. She leaned her head against the wall where the mortar was roughest. She thought of the mason, Thomas, and wondered if his bones were now part of the very earth she sat upon. She thought of the sister she had left behind, now a woman with her own children, perhaps forgetting that her elder sibling still breathed behind the chancel. There was no bitterness left. The resentment she had felt toward the priest, the village, and even toward God, had evaporated. In the absolute isolation of the end, even the concept of self felt like a heavy coat she was finally allowed to take off. She heard a sound, not a hallucination, but a real, physical scratching at the external slit. A small bird, a robin, had sought shelter from the sleet. She could hear the frantic beat of its tiny heart, a rapid-fire rhythm against the stillness. For a moment, she felt an overwhelming urge to reach out, to warm it, to save it. But her hands would not move. She realized then that she and the bird were the same, two pulses of light in a vast, dark cathedral, each trapped in their own fragile architecture. As the midnight hour approached, the silence of the cell became luminous. The walls seemed to pull back, expanding until the room was as wide as the firmament. She saw that her freedom had never been about the space she occupied, but about the quality of the silence she kept. She had been a prisoner of her own will, and only the dissolution of that will could set her free. The morning sun rose, cold and pale, casting a final sliver of gold through the squint. When the young deacon arrived to push the daily ration of bread through the hatch, he noticed the bread from the day before remained untouched. He called out her name, but the only response was the whistling of the wind through the bell tower. When they finally broke the seal of the masonry, clinking away the stones that Thomas had laid with such permanence, they found her sitting upright, her back against the wall, her eyes open and fixed on the high altar she could finally see without the obstruction of a slit. Her skin was the color of old parchment, her hands folded in her lap like two dried lilies. The villagers wept, calling it a miracle of holy endurance. They touched her robes and scraped bits of mortar from the cell to keep as relics. They saw a saint who had conquered the flesh, they did not see the woman who had simply run out of ways to hide from the truth. History would record her as the anchoress of Oakhaven, a beacon of faith in a dark century. But as the wind carried the dust of her broken cell across the churchyard, it whispered a different story, that the greatest tragedy of the human heart is not that it breaks, but that it builds such beautiful, terrible walls to keep from breaking, only to find that the light was always waiting for the stone to fall.
Like and subscribe to this channel for more interesting stories.